Howdy, everyone. This is the talk with the Chinese Alpha, and we're going to discuss the Chinese market and how COVID has affected that. We have Kevin here, and he's just going to give an amazing talk about this.
Okay, can everybody see this?
Yep.
Yep.
So it's all good. So, hi, my name is Kevin Marcaida. I am the research lead for Chinese Alpha. We're essentially an equity research platform based in Shanghai, but we have researchers all around the world. And essentially right now, I will be doing a guest lecture on analyzing China's COVID-19 strategy. So just a little bit of background about myself. So I actually went into university studying biomedical science. So I am fully qualified and accredited as a biomedical scientist. I worked for the NHS, so the National Health Service in England for a year. I've been in a number of publications, such as Sage publications, and also I've graduated to a master's level degree at Imperial College London. After that, I had a couple of internships at Citibank and JP Morgan as an analyst in investment banking and sales and trading, where I then started to work for Chinese Alpha and also investing in a number of startups, real estates and franchises. And today I will be using my scientific background plus the finance knowledge in order to analyze what's happening in China right now. So just as a quick timeline or overview, I'll be introducing COVID-19, China's response to COVID-19, analyzing China's zero COVID policy, and also looking into what's currently happening in China right now, especially with all the lockdowns in Shanghai. Also some predictions and recommendations for the Chinese government, followed then by a conclusion. Then after that, Kimo Bruns will take over and also talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected their supply chain. So what exactly is China's zero COVID strategy? So the China CDC COVID-19 emergency response team, they described their elimination strategy or zero COVID strategy in a paper in The Lancet in June 2020. So when an infected person is identified, all close contacts are required to undergo a 14-day centralized quarantine with multiple rounds of PCR testing. And essentially what they do is they try to identify infected persons as early as possible. And that's to prevent its wider spread into the community. And this way they can maintain this zero COVID statistic throughout. And essentially during outbreaks, they would carry out something called community-wide PCR testing. So they would test people in bulk, pooling them. There's one instance where they tested 11 million people in less than 3 days. And they do that to quickly identify infected people before they go into the community. Also, as part of the zero COVID strategy, certain demographics are subject to compulsory PCR testing, especially those who are frontline workers, those people that deal with people coming from abroad. Medical staff, for instance, have to have a double jab and also the PCR testing. So as many of you know, China right now is undergoing a lockdown. And here are just some images I found online on various different cities all around China. So as many of you know, nucleic acid sampling station, this is something that's very common right now. Also happening in China due to lockdown, especially in Shanghai, there is actually a food shortage supply. And if you go on Chinese social media, there's actually been a lot of memes going around saying that there isn't enough vegetables. So our vegetable is not in very good supply right now. And as a result of this, many people are actually beginning to protest, which is very unusual in China. People don't tend to protest a lot, but we've seen a number of these types of protests occurring all around China, especially in Wuhan and Shanghai. And right here is just an image of a central quarantine system. It's basically a place where you have to quarantine. It's compulsory. Sometimes they take you without your consent. And the image here, this here, is actually one of our friends. So she's been stuck in quarantine for a very long time. And this is just a situation. She's not been outside for 2 months. And yeah, to us westernized people, it's quite a insane thing to see, but it just gives you a flavor of what's happening there right now. So in terms of China's initial response, they only reported, basically 0.0%, 0.05% of global cases, despite making up 19% of the world's population. So essentially, their initial response was pretty successful because they eliminated infected cases within 2 months of local infections from the initial infection in Wuhan. And also, since the end of the outbreak in Wuhan, there have been smaller outbreaks caused by imported cases, and these cases have been controlled through strict, localized public health measures, and this will be something that I will discuss later on. And here's just a statistic. So when the Wuhan lockdown was initiated, you can see the cases beginning to rise with changes to laboratory confirmed cases and clinical diagnosis cases obviously rising. But over the span of 2 months since the outbreak, the number of cases have pretty much dropped to near zero for the next 18 months. And it just goes to show how successful these non-pharmacological interventions are. So these cases, the drop in cases are actually without the use of a vaccine. And it just goes to show how quickly the Chinese government has actually reacted to this outbreak. So what are non-pharmacological interventions? So essentially they're interventions that don't use vaccines. So typically this is a traditional approach. So using masks, social distancing, restriction of public events, travel restrictions, something that you would experience yourself. But in China, they have something called centralized quarantine, meaning that if you are tested with the coronavirus, you are taken to a facility where essentially you would have to live the rest of your quarantine, or essentially for a couple of, maybe even a couple of months, where you're taken against your own will, and you'd have to live there. You have to share your facilities with other infected people. And from a health perspective, this has actually been pretty successful, as I've shown. But again, it can be very controversial. So this is one of those facilities here, and they can build these in an extremely ridiculous fast pace. So this was built in less than a month, all this. And this is what typically is inside. So this one is, the one on the left-hand side isn't quite as good. This is something that was already created beforehand. This is just a warehouse being converted into a quarantine center. But on the right-hand side, if you're a little bit lucky, then you might be able to get into a more modern quarantine facility, which is a little bit nicer. So other non-pharmacological interventions includes the novel approach. So China were the pioneer to the track and trace model. Also, the use of mathematical modeling and data analytics became a lot more common. Also, the use of nucleic PCR testing. And lastly, the pooled PCR testing is something unique. So that's essentially when they take a large group of people and then they would test them through PCR. They managed to test 11 million people in less than 3 days in Jillian, which, to be fair, is insane. As a biomedical scientist myself, the workload that they've been put through and the pace they're working at is just, I've never seen anything like that before. So this is pooled PCR testing. Essentially, they would have a swab through the nose. This would be tested and you get the results within 15 minutes. However, by no means is this strategy anywhere near effective. So there's a concept called total population susceptibility. So this is the percentage of the general population that's vulnerable to infection. And the thing about this zero COVID strategy they have is that this is very effective for local transmission. So local transmission has been practically at near zero. However, the main vulnerability of the zero COVID strategy is that it's very vulnerable to imported cases of virus from international travel. So here are just some statistics. So serological surveys, so these are surveys that test the antibodies of people. And essentially what they found is that the number of antibodies decreased from Wuhan from 4% to less than 1%. And what this means is that about 99.9% of Chinese population is susceptible. And that's because of this zero COVID strategy, meaning that a lot of people out there are susceptible to infection. And also because of the way that the zero COVID strategy is organized, it's very vulnerable to imported cases. So a lot of their main cases right now are actually imported. So more than 20 outbreaks were caused by imported cases in 2020 alone. And the fact that this is becoming a lot more transmissible means that it requires more effort and therefore more economic impact in order to contain future variants. So this is essentially what I was describing. So this is where Wuhan is, or Hubei. And as you can see, the seropositivity actually decreases from the epicenter. And basically that means that you're more likely to become infected because your body is not used to generating enough antibodies in order to combat the virus. And also from various studies on these non-pharmacological interventions, they're actually inadequate by itself. So this is something that China actually failed to take into account. So essentially, the effective reproduction number, so anything greater than 1 means that the virus reproduces faster than it's eliminated. And with China, their effective reproduction number is actually greater than 1, meaning that there is some level of community transmission actually occurring, even though that's in extremely small amounts. What this means is that NPIs alone are inadequate to stop community transmission, and therefore vaccination has to be a key strategy to China's health policy. So vaccination is very important in order to reduce the effective reproduction number below 1. And what the NPIs essentially do is bought China enough time to allow the population to be vaccinated and also to build up new hospitals and to hire new doctors. So in that way, it was successful, but only partially. And their vaccination strategy is extremely controversial. So in most Western countries, they would vaccinate the health workers first, then the vulnerable people, the elderly people. But China did something completely different, and they went against typical advice from scientists. And what they did was they gave the vaccine to working class people for secondly. Okay, and the reason to why they did this is because China cares more about the economic growth rather than the health of the people. Now, in most Western countries, they vaccinated the elderly, but these people vaccinated working class, healthy people first. And that's because China is very, a lot of their economic growth is due to a labor-driven market. And they want to keep their labor force as healthy as possible. So what they're doing is, instead of vaccinating the old people who are not unproductive in society, they would vaccinate the young people who are capable of working. And this is because China sees things through this China-US rivalry. They want to overtake the US. They want to become the top economy in the world. And unfortunately, because of this, they've prioritized economic growth over the health of the people. And also because China is actually an aging population, they have an increasing dependency rate, they have a higher cost of living, and also as a result of the 1 and 2 child policies, their population is aging. And if they want to overtake the US, they have to keep working class people healthy. And that's why they've vaccinated these younger people first over the older people. But unfortunately, this is now biting them back. And I'll explain why later. And initially, this was very successful, this vaccination strategy, because they vaccinated the working class people first. In fact, their economy bounced back very quickly. In fact, during the pandemic itself, China's economy grew by 18.3% post-COVID. So clearly, this strategy worked out from an economic standpoint. However, from a health standpoint, I cannot say the same case, especially with what's happening right now. So essentially my evaluation of their initial vaccination strategy. So most scientists at that time said, you know what, this is very successful simply because there's very low number of cases. There's only 3.2 deaths per 1 million people, which is among the lowest in developed nations. However, what they did fail to consider is the spread of the virus, especially with more transmissible variants. And that's what's happening right now. And initially, the global reaction to the zero COVID policy was actually pretty positive. So Donald Trump in January actually praised China, surprisingly. So China has been working very hard to contain the coronavirus. The US greatly appreciates their efforts and transparency. It will all work out well, and particularly on behalf of the American people, I want to take seeds. However, he did backtrack a little bit, maybe because of political politics. And also Germany, the health minister has also mentioned how great the strategy is. Now, this is very interesting. There have been a lot of talk in the news, in the media, saying that China's figures are fake. And one of the prominent cases was when two United States officials actually said that China had deliberately concealed its cases and deaths. And this is according to a secret report by the US intelligence community. And this is the actual quote itself. So the Chinese government does not know the extent of the outbreak because lower level officials falsified statistics in order to avoid losing their positions. And personally, I think from our experience of Chinese Alpha, I think there is some truth to this. Certainly, corruption is something common in China. It's something that occurs on a frequent basis. However, there was an article in Global Public Health, which actually examined the possibility of these inaccurate death counts. However, they did conclude that because of the lack of deaths of Hong Kong and Taiwan residents, which would actually be newsworthy, this discrepancy between the official and the true death count is not particularly large. So the commentary article does acknowledge there to be some discrepancies. However, it wouldn't be as large as what some people would be saying. Now, super variants and the downfall of COVID. So variants are becoming a lot more transmissible. So their reproduction rate has been greater than 1. They're also becoming a lot less deadlier, so their mortality rate is decreasing. And as a response, China, they still went with their zero COVID strategy, and they deployed in some areas such as in Shenzhen, Shenyang, and Jilin. Shanghai, initially, they tried to avoid lockdown because they know that it has a high economic impact. However, they did issue a snap lockdown in late March. And as a result, these measures have actually seen some rare pushback from residents over the perceived lack of benefit. And as you can see, the number of cases have been rising since March, and hence why they initiated a full lockdown. Now, in terms of the economic cost of the current lockdown, it cost them a lot of money. So 46 billion a month, which is equivalent to 3% of GDP in lost economic output. And this is just in a month. You know, if this continues, then they can certainly lose a lot more money. And the thing is, this is just a conservative value, actually. So the figures could be a lot higher. And the impact could even become greater if they impose lockdowns on other cities apart from just Shanghai. So as a quick overview, I'm not going to go into the science of it, but most viruses, when they mutate, they try to become more transmissible. And it's due to an accumulated amount of errors made during replication. However, there is a limit to how fast a virus can mutate, because a virus that mutates too much is more prone to collapse. So why am I saying this? Well, it's actually a critical reason to why China are using a zero COVID strategy. Number one, there is a reason that's going around in the news. Most analysts on the news will say China wants to show the world its way is better. Even though the virus is becoming more transmissible, there's lack of benefit to it. However, there is another reason to why they're using the COVID strategy, this zero COVID strategy. And that's because China has no other option but to use a zero COVID strategy. They can't afford to vaccinate people. They can't afford to increase the number of hospitalizations. And that's because China has a very poor healthcare system. Their healthcare system is terrible. Now, even before the pandemic, their healthcare system struggles to deliver basic healthcare to many of its citizens, particularly in China's rural and western regions. Why? Because their healthcare system, their spending is very low compared to other countries, even with similar incomes. They also have an aging population. That's because of the one-child policy that they implemented a long time ago, meaning that there aren't many young people out there and there's a lot of older people out there. And this is leading to a lot of chronic conditions, which is dragging down their healthcare system. And also, China is incredibly corrupt and inefficient. And as a result of this, out-of-pocket costs in China accounts for 28% of all healthcare expenditures, compared to just 11% in the US. And lastly, they're way too over-reliant on these large hospitals in order to provide basic care. So even if you live, even if there's a hospital right next to you, you'd prefer to go to a large urban hospital, and this would cost a lot more money. This puts a lot of strain on these hospitals. And the reason to why this I'll explain it later, actually. So let's get back to aging. So aging is a huge population. Here's just some statistics. So the number of over 65s forecasted to increase. And in the same time period, the number of young people is actually decreasing. So this is going to create a lot of problems, not just from a health perspective, but also from an economic perspective, because China is a labor-driven market. Now, other aspects of the Chinese healthcare system, in terms of their hospitals, they only represent a small fraction of healthcare providers, only 3.5% in 2019, but they handle 45% of all outpatient visits. It creates a lot of strain on doctors, on nurses, on the amount of beds they have. And as a result, if they lift COVID-19 restrictions, this would put even more strain on their healthcare system. And it cannot even cope without the COVID itself. But with COVID and without these restrictions, coronavirus would kill a lot of people, especially the older unvaccinated people. So essentially, China is forcing these strict lockdowns because its healthcare system simply can't cope with any increase in demand. And that's why they're doing this right now. That's why it's so strict. Because one, their vaccine is hugely ineffective. Their healthcare system is incredibly poor. And there are also political motivations to why they're doing this, because they want to exercise political control. There's also a sense of government pride, because they want to show the US or Western countries that their way is simply better. So here's just a quick recap. So there's a lack of efficiency in the Chinese vaccine. It could be as low as 50% by some researchers alone, and that's probably going to continue to decrease with the variants, with more and more variants. They also have a large population of elderly people that are unvaccinated, and as many of you know, elderly people are the ones that are vulnerable, and this is their fault because they decided to prioritize vaccinating healthy working class people first and not the elderly. And now they've noticed that the number of deaths for the elderly is increasing, and hence why the lockdown is becoming even more stricter. Thirdly, their poor healthcare system. And this is going to get even worse, especially as the variants become more transmissible, and it's going to become even more costly. So as the end of the recap, China has no other choice than to impose these hard lockdowns in its current situation. Just a quick conclusion. So the zero COVID policy, in my opinion, in the first 18 months was successful, primarily because the number of cases were low, the number of deaths were low. However, they failed to see the strategy in the long term because they failed to vaccinate the most vulnerable people in the medium term because they favored economic growth over the health. Again, this zero COVID-19 policy that they've implemented, it will continue to become tested as the variants become a lot more transmissible over time. And therefore, there will be more effort and high economic impact as a result to bring future outbreaks into control. And lastly, as a recommendation, China needs to upgrade its healthcare system. And they need to do that by building a holistic primary healthcare system, not just built on primary hospitals in urbanized places, but also build hospitals in rural areas where patients can actually access these hospitals easily. And lastly, reducing inequalities between urban and rural areas. So Kimo Bruns, you can now take over since these are your slides.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, so basically I will briefly talk about what are the supply chain implications that this new lockdown will have on the Chinese and also global economy. And for the first slide, I picked a few news articles here, and most of them talk either about basically how the lockdown will actually cause increased inflation and also may bring the factory of the world to a halt. And secondly, the sources and news supply chain related talk about how this can have an effect on foreign economies, like the US economy, as supply chain ripple effects can cause a delayed effect on what we see in the stores and what we can actually access, and also the prices will increase. And we see here that that most major news outlets are really concerned with that. We see, for example, Reuters saying that China's widening COVID curbs threaten global supply chain paralysis. We see, for example, The Guardian stating that will China zero our COVID policy bring the world's factory to a halt? And very interesting also that some news outlets actually state the Chinese lockdown will create shocks to American supply chain, but China is the biggest loser. So I will just go a bit more in detail on the different dimensions here. Maybe you can just hop to the next slide. I think you have the controller, Kevin. Beautiful. First of all, let's talk about some short-term impacts. So in the short term, more or less, we can see the question is what is happening to the citizens. As Kevin mentioned, they're in a lockdown, so people are majorly concerned in the world. Like they look on China, say like, okay, is it maybe like Fox News states the largest prison camp in human history? And just shocked, okay, what happens to the workers? What happens to the normal citizens? Then they basically look at the goods that are stuck in China. That's the obvious thing. It's a superficial level. And then they basically see, okay, China is the odd one out because everybody is basically saying, okay, we accept COVID as a daily, as part of our daily lives, and basically say, okay, it's normal. It's like a normal disease. We get infected, we get vaccinated. And China is the odd one out, trying to go a different route, which is necessary, as Kevin explained. But still, for us, China just seems to be the odd child, the oddball. And then we see a grave job situation because we basically see that people can't really follow their jobs anymore, because not every job can be done from home. These are the major obvious short-term impacts. What can be emphasized also, that basically Shanghai handles a fifth of China's port volume, so the lockdown in Shanghai is more significant than the one in Wuhan, because for the global economy, Shanghai really plays a major role. And also there's a paradox between economic growth and zero COVID, because China basically now has two conflicting goals. They want to have the steady growth and basically want to have their growth keep up. On the other hand, they want to enforce zero COVID. So the only way they could do it was the stimulus, but now it's basically a paradoxical challenge. And what we'll see basically in the short term also is a grave impact on the patients with chronic and non-COVID related diseases, because we can basically see that those medical diseases are not really treated in the hospitals, but the people rather have to be treated at home or not be treated at all and just suffer from their chronic illness. Those are the short-term things we see, but now let's dig a bit deeper in what that basically means for the implications for our global economy. And globally, it means basically that China is 20% of the global demand, but its role in supply chain is much bigger than that. So we're not talking about supply. China is an export country, and many companies are basically manufacturing their goods in China. And so bring that to a halt really brings the whole operation strategy also to a different challenge, and the whole world is basically becoming less flat. Once was said a few years ago, I think it was a decade ago, that the world is becoming more flat and flat as supply chains stretch out to be global, and we are getting more efficient to produce wherever the cheapest, because communication is so easy. But now we see that supply chains are becoming more regional again, because we have the challenges of basically those disruptions, those risks. And but until now, we can't really do anything because so much manufacturing operation is in China. So at the moment, we are just at the mercy of whatever happens with the Chinese manufacturing facilities, right? In order to have our own companies also keep on producing. Otherwise, the product is just not arriving, and we will see the same thing on our shelves. And lastly, China's COVID crisis could impact growth rates around the world. What we can see is just like not that we see only the growth rate in China will decline, but it could have an impact on basically the global economy and global growth rates, as we see a knock-on effect from China to the global world. And also we see a big increase in supply chain uncertainty that will affect many companies and will definitely change the way they are planning from basically reactive to a more proactive approach. Yeah, we're already in the next slide. That's perfect. No, one back. Yeah, perfect. So let's quickly jump around and see what we can say about the implications for local economy. And for the local economy, we can basically see that China is at this moment in a very vulnerable state. So whenever was, for example, the right time for Vietnam to double down and overtake China as a factory hub, that might be now the right time, and we can see, maybe we can see that increasingly more manufacturing will be given to other countries, as it was already the case, because China is getting more expensive. We can also see that 40% of China's GDP is basically locked at the moment through the lockdown, which is an insane number. But when we see metropolitan cities like Shanghai being locked, it just means that much. Then we see that stopping the current COVID wave is likely to come at the expense of an economic slowdown. And we can see this projection from ENG, basically that the GDP will decrease from 4.8 to 4.6% growth. So this means basically that the current situation is an impact of the policies greater than that epidemic. So basically the pandemic, just as it is, would not have had this kind of economic impact, but through the political influence, basically the government made the economic impact worse than would be with a proper vaccination strategy than as in other countries. But of course, they don't want to put their pride in a shadow and want to take, for example, Western vaccines or that are more efficient. Also, we can see that China's slowdown is the product of its code restrictions, and basically the consumer price growth is also a problem here, basically, in the local economy. And the local officials are obviously also overreacting, and this can also cause a bullwhip effect in the supply chains, because you can see that people are locking down and trying to order more and more, and supply chains have to react to that at a rapid speed. And so basically the reordering will lead to more and more orders down the line, and will create artificial demand down the line, basically, as we see those panic close downs of cities because they are feared of the consequences. Okay, let's jump to the last slide. So what long-term impacts could that have, basically? So we can see that China's lockdown is likely to cause basically this slowdown in the growth, and also for imports. So basically the Chinese people will have less of a buying power, and also there will be less economic growth, and this will basically result that supply chain disruptions could outweigh also the slower growth. So slower growth is just a side product, but supply chain disruptions will really be the biggest problem. The slower growth can be cured with stimuli, but supply chain disruptions are already there, and we will see the real impact of them basically in the next month. So this is something that we don't see now in the short term. We see in the next month. So we see that them vibrating through the supply chains to the world with a delayed effect. And we have to brace for that also in the financial market, and anticipate that. Okay, I think that was it. Thank you for your attention, and I think you learned something about both factors, about basically the political dimension, the healthcare dimension, and also what would be the long-term implications here. I think I give back to Kevin for the Q&A.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was. Oh, sorry.
go for it. Anyways, we're more than happy to ask, if you guys have any questions for us, then we're more than happy to, answer.
Yeah, I thought that was such a great presentation. One question that I had was, due to like the aging population in China and how the working class is kind of getting shrunk down, do you think that's going to significantly impact their productional capacity in the future? Or do you think like they've created enough technology to subsidize that shrinking working class?
I think surely over the short term and medium term, then this would absolutely have immediate impact on them, simply because they're not quite as technologically advanced compared to America, for instance. But in their 5-year plan, technology and manufacturing, especially smart manufacturing, is #1 priority for them, because they know that they have an aging population. I think they are building up those capacities, but it's a lot slower than what we anticipated. Certainly in the long term, this will have a very minimal impact, but short term and medium term, it doesn't look great for them.
So yeah, so now they're like trying to make the investment into those technologies because they've realized that their population has shrunk so much, like you said, from the one-child policy and things like that. So that's very interesting. Thank you.
They've actually relaxed the one-child policy very recently, I think last year, and they've now made it a 2-child policy because they know that they've noticed, wait a second, this one-child policy isn't working. We're getting older, and more chronic conditions, are increasing. The number of cancer incidences are increasing. This is creating a huge economic impact for us. We should increase the number of young people in order to compensate, decrease this dependency rate. And I feel that it's a bit too late. This is going to take many years for them to fix, unfortunately. And now they've begun to pivot into the more smart manufacturing, into the technology investments. Any
Okay,
further questions?
yeah, so like I came a bit late to the meeting, so what would you, like in addition to like relaxing like their COVID policies, what do you think is needed for China to recover?
Yeah.
In their economically.
I think the first thing that they need to do is to vaccinate the elderly people, simply because the elderly are the ones that have all the chronic conditions. They're the ones that are more likely to be frequently ill. And the thing about their elderly population is they have a large portion of elderly people that are not vaccinated, simply because there's a lot of misinformation online saying how the vaccine is ineffective, how it could kill the elderly people. And also there's a lack of trust with Western medication. So primarily because of the Chinese government, primarily because of the vaccines having terrible headlines in China. So that's the first thing that they should do, is to vaccinate the elderly people, and that's through a proper marketing campaign. And secondly, I think in the long term, because they have such a poor healthcare system, they really need to invest in making hospitals, especially in rural areas where people can actually go to. Because right now, people from rural areas are traveling to the city, and as a result of this, these hospitals, these very few urban hospitals, have such high demand, but not enough doctors, not enough beds in order to accommodate this demand, especially if people are traveling thousands of kilometers just to visit one hospital. And also there's an inequality in terms of how medical education is done in China. So rural doctors don't even have a bachelor's degree. And that's why there's such a mistrust of going to a rural hospital in comparison to an urban hospital, where most doctors would have a bachelor's degree. They'd be qualified officially. This is something that they need to sort out in the very long term. So increase their healthcare expenditure, increase the number of hospitals, increase the number of general practitioners they have. And lastly, their healthcare system is notoriously corrupt, hugely corrupt. In fact, most doctors, their number one complaint is the very low salary. So most doctors, what they do is there's a culture in China where it's perfectly okay to accept bribes. And as a result, these doctors would prioritize those people that pay bribes and don't prioritize the people that don't pay bribes. And this creates a system that is hugely inefficient. It was hugely inefficient even before COVID, and it's going to get even worse, especially if COVID becomes more transmissible. So I think we have a question in chat. Chinese vaccine is ineffective. Chinese people do not want to get it because China don't have the kind of technological capacity. That is correct. So I looked at some statistics on the Chinese vaccine, and it's about 50% effective. And if you compare that to Western vaccines, especially for Omicron, it's about 60 to 70%. And those tiny percentages, they really matter, especially if the rate determining step. So the variants are becoming more transmissible, and those tiny percentages, they compound. Essentially, the faster the virus becomes more transmissible. I hope that makes sense, but this is why they have such a huge issue with the healthcare system right now. And also the way that vaccinated people, they vaccinated the healthy people first over the elderly people, and it shouldn't be that way.
Yeah. Also, that they tell basically that people, oh, it's fine, you don't need to get vaccinated. We have a zero COVID policy. So people are very reluctant to actually get vaccinated because the politicians basically tell them we have everything under control. You don't need to get vaccinated, but it's not that simple, right? Because it's a very transmissive disease in the end. Yeah.
I have a question, like how much of the Chinese population was given like the Chinese vaccine in comparison to like the Western vaccines? Is that information given or no?
They don't give statistics on that, unfortunately.
Okay.
We're not 100% sure. China tends to be very opaque with this kind of stuff, but I would imagine, since China is very prideful, I would imagine that the vast majority of people have the Chinese vaccine, with a very few number of people having the Western vaccines. But unfortunately, we don't have the statistics for that.
But we know that the Western vaccines are basically not regarded as proper vaccines in China. So if you're vaccinated with a Western vaccine, basically you count as unvaccinated.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
interesting.
that's a fact. And that is why basically, like, I'm not even sure if you could legally get the Western vaccine in China. You probably have to get it through some drug routes or something from the West. Or basically you have to travel to the West to get it, right? That makes the most sense. If you want to get it in China, probably some illegal routes. But China does not accept the Western vaccine as properly tested. It's yeah, China only accepts their own vaccine.
So you'd have to, like, if you did get like the Western vaccine, you'd have to go back and get like the Chinese vaccine as
Yes,
well? Okay.
yes. In order to count
Huh.
as vaccinated, yeah. If you have a
Or you
vaccine,
could forge the documents or something like that, either or.
yeah, I mean, you could try. I mean, obviously, but I mean, the Western vaccine is probably then just like a flu shot. So I had friends of mine who actually got the Western vaccine, moved back to China, and they just had to get another vaccine. And otherwise, they couldn't basically count as vaccinated there. Yeah, the other way around is the same. I think the West doesn't accept the Chinese vaccine, but the catch here, the Western vaccine is actually quite efficient compared to the Chinese vaccine. And China, of course, does not really want to accept any foreign vaccines and want to actually say, okay, they're more efficient, we take them. And they're very, very, very proud country, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
I just want to step in really quick and just thank you guys for coming out tonight. I really, I found it to be really informative. I'm glad I attended. I just wanted to ask really quick how COVID and the zero COVID policy has actually affected your guys' day-to-day work at Chinese Alpha.
For me, I'm not affected at all because I live in the UK, so it doesn't really affect us. COVID here doesn't exist, so no one here wears masks. Practically everyone here is vaccinated. But I was in Asia a couple of weeks ago, and the lockdowns and the restrictions are very, very tight. So in terms of my work, not really affected. Kimo.
Yeah, basically colleagues of mine who basically work in Shanghai, they have been directly affected by it. They're locked in their homes. Also professionals who work with, they can't really access any like data banks, for example, that we want them to work with. And sometimes it's just things are a lot slower when we have the our to work together with our colleagues in China, and also the work routines are a lot slower, and we basically at least see that. But apart from this, I mean, I'm happy that I'm not in China at the moment, and I think for the next month I will also not travel to China because it's a very complicated situation. And I just wish the best for our friends there, that they keep strong while they're in lockdown, and we hope that it doesn't like last for another 2 months, because it's like it's a bit like prison. I have to admit that, right? But from afar, it's of course like a very interesting situation also to analyze. It's very different, and also from a supply chain perspective, it's interesting to see how they actually got handled and rolled up.
I have one more question. So is Vietnam primarily the alternative country to source from besides China due to like the lower labor costs, or are there like are there more like Southeast Asian countries that companies are sourcing from?
Vietnam is one of the #1 countries where basically Chinese manufacturing is moving at the moment, because of the lower prices and also because of the capabilities that they developed over the years. But there are other contestants as well. The main problem is that the China is basically changing from being a developing country to being kind of a developed country, because they have their own innovation. many people are quite rich there. I mean, obviously it's not a developed country yet, but for many people and for many companies, it's not that profitable anymore to produce in China. And you can see that basically when it comes to some products that have become more expensive, especially hand painted products. It's just prices rise, and yeah, capitalism is looking for a new victim, and China is obviously not the cheapest anymore. And I mean, and if the supply chain problems in China increase, of course there is some movement to basically have a multiple tiering strategy, and basically go have the other supply in another country. And the more problems there are, the more business goes to Vietnam. Vietnam is the number one contester here. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
I can also say a few words on that. I think increasingly over the next few years, the Philippines, especially the north of the Philippines, will also be a source of outsourcing, primarily for food as well. The reason why I know so much is because I run a farm in the north of the Philippines, and the people who are building the roads are the Chinese. They're building 2 new airports simply because the food there is incredibly cheap. They're essentially exporting all the food from the Philippines, and they're bringing it back to Hong Kong, to mainland China. And this is something that we'll probably see a lot more, especially with myself. In my farm, I'm getting a lot more Chinese customers now. They want to get rice on the cheap, and primarily this is something that's going to keep happening.
That's some valuable information as well, because I've heard like China's been buying a lot of land in a lot of areas, like in Africa and a lot of other countries, because of like needing greater food supply for their growing population. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, last one. So you said like China is still not like fully developed yet. Because I've heard like, you know, like some metrics say like they are developed, you know, or like are they like they're considered like first world. So
yeah,
are you saying they're not, or like when do you think they are going to be, you know, like fully developed, I guess?
I mean, it's of course a gray zone, but for example, if you look for what are the indicators of a first world country, and there you basically say, for example, that there needs to be a certain income, a certain standard of living, like no poverty or no hunger, and still in rural areas of China, it's a developing country. It's far away from being a developed country. But if you look in the metropolitan areas, like Shanghai, like Beijing, it feels like it is probably a developed country. But you cannot just see parts of China separate from the whole, because it's a very big country, and some areas are developing, some other areas are developed. So we are at the moment in a transitional zone where the tables are turning.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Any other questions? And if not, thank you so much for this presentation. I learned a ton. And I think everyone that watches the recording will definitely learn a lot as well. So thank you so much. And thank you for getting up so early. I know like 5 a.m. there, and then it's probably night in Hawaii. So, you know, you need to get some sleep. But
thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. And that's the end of the meeting. All right.
Thank you so much, guys.